Hello and welcome! Today we are going to talk about maps. We're going to talk about world building, geography, and astronomy, and a few other sciencey things as well. Let's get started. If you've read any fantasy at all, basically, you know that maps are very important. They're always there in the beginning of the book. You don't always care about them, nor even really look at them, but they're always there. So in this video, we're going to discuss how to make them, what to think about, and also whether or not you really do need to make them. And that's really two questions. Do you need to have them in the book, and do you need to make them at all, even if you don't want them in the book? The answer to whether or not you need them in the book, it's mostly, high fantasy that has a map, and there are actually a lot of fantasy genres that don't even have the map. Urban fantasy almost never has a map. But even if you're writing epic high fantasy stories, you only really need the map if it's absolutely necessary for the story. That is, if there's travel or if there are mentions of a lot of different places. Like, for example, if you're writing a highly political story and you're mentioning all of these countries, then maybe it would be good to have a map for the reader to know where they are in relation to each other, these countries or places that you mention. That said, in my opinion, you don't actually need to have the map in the book. The thing is, I tend to look at the map, but I never tend to refer back to it, and I don't actually remember if this place was actually to the south of this other place, but maybe that's just me. So say you don't want a map in your book, do you still need to make one? There, I do want to say probably yes. It's good to have, if nothing else, for consistency in your story. It's good for you to know where things are in relation to each other, how far away something is, if it's feasible, that it takes 2 days to travel from point A to point B, and the easiest way for you to remember if that is correct is to have a map. And that's just for the purpose of the story. For the purpose of world building, I think it's even more important to have a map because so much else in your world building is going to depend on the map. So in other videos in this world building series, I am going to refer back to the map quite a few times, and I will do that for very good reasons. So now let's talk about how to make them. And like I said, I am going to talk about geography and how to make a planet or a continent or an island or whatever it is that you're trying to make. I am also going to talk a bit about astronomy, both for the sake of science fiction writers out there, but also, just to create a night sky for your fantasy world, for example. So there will be timestamps in the description if you're not interested in everything that I'm going to talk about. Also remember that you do not have to agree with me on every single point that I'm bringing up in this video. You don't have to use every single thing. I almost never use every single thing. And just feel free to pick and choose. So when it comes to making a map, just as with every other piece of world building, there are different levels of ambition, and you should place yourself wherever you're comfortable and wherever you feel is necessary for your story or for the world building you want to do. What you probably want to do at the very least is make a map of the area that your story takes place in, and the area immediately around it. And for any other area in the world that is mentioned, at least if it's mentioned as something important, and not just this traveler from whatever place far away. Exactly how you can make a map, either you can draw it, you can use there's the macaroni trick that comes from Tumblr. I'm going to put the username here of the person who came up with it on Tumblr, which is basically just throw out a bunch of macaroni on a piece of paper and then draw around it, and there you have a continent or an island or whatever. There are also a whole bunch of fantasy map generators out there on the internet. I have never actually used any of these because I like drawing, but I'm going to link a few that looks promising in the description below as well if you need them. Of course, just drawing a continent isn't quite enough. After you've done that, or before you do that, depending on how you want to do things, you need to consider the climate of your world. Climate, to an extent, is relatively easy. It depends on where on the globe the part of the world that you're trying to make is. If it's near the equator, it probably has jungles and rainforests and things like that. If it's slightly to the south or to the north, you probably have desert. And then, of course, it becomes colder and colder the further away you get from the equator and the closer to any of the poles. That is on which latitude you are. That, however, is not the only thing that affects what kind of climate you've got. There are ocean currents and wind and the topography of your world, so if you have valleys or mountains and things like that, that also affects what kind of climate you've got. For example, Sweden and Siberia are roughly on the same latitude, but we have wildly different climates. One of the reasons for that is that Sweden has the Gulf Stream, which warms us up, so we're warmer than Siberia. But there's also the fact that Siberia is further inland, and being further inland, that means that they have a greater variation in temperature. So the difference between the warmest point of the summer and the coldest point of the winter is much greater in Siberia than it is in Sweden. Also, the warmest point of the day and the coldest point of the day are going to be much more different in Siberia than in Sweden. This is because large bodies of water, so the ocean or a large lake, will help even out the temperature over the day and over the year. So the further away you are from such a large body of water, the more extreme the temperatures are going to be. And these are just some of the things that affect the kind of climate you have in different parts of the world. I'm not going to mention all of these, and if you want to make it easy for yourself, just look at how far away are things from the equator or the poles. If you want to make things more complicated for yourself, I'm going to have a few resources linked in the description to where you can find out more about climate. Leaving climate for a little bit, I want to talk briefly about tectonics. Now, we've all read about tectonic plates in school, I assume, and so we know that they cover the planet and they move around and they're important for the creations of mountains and islands and certain natural disasters like earthquakes and volcanoes and things like that. I'm not going to go too deep into exactly what tectonic plates do or are, because that would make a very, very long video. But one thing that you should consider about tectonics, especially if you're making more than one continent, is that these continents should sort of fit together like puzzle pieces. You can see that about our world, and of course the reason for this is that all of the land masses on Earth were once just one, and because of tectonic plates, they broke apart and they now look like they do. This is not a science lesson, just so you know. I am simplifying a lot of things in this video. And like I said before, tectonic plates are responsible for creating mountains where they meet or where they are being pulled apart. Either way, in the borders between tectonic plates, that is generally where you are going to find mountains. And this means, among other things, that mountains are generally found in some sort of ridge and not just, here is a mountain all of a sudden with no other mountains around it. That's kind of an important thing if you want some sort of realism to your mountains. Volcanoes you're mostly also going to find in the borders between tectonic plates, but volcanoes can actually form elsewhere as well. Again, don't ask me about the science of this. If you want a volcano where there are no tectonic plates or not even a mountain, then look up how that could happen, because it can happen, but you might want to be aware of at least the basics of how if you're going to make something like that. Now your world has some mountains, and from those mountains there are probably going to flow a fair few rivers. The rivers from mountains usually come from snowmelt or from rain that gathers up in a basin somewhere on top of the mountain and then flows out of that basin as a river. Now, some very basic things about rivers. They are going to flow from your mountains to the sea, and they are going to be combining, so rivers and streams flowing into each other, but they are not going to split up. This is very important for realism. The only times that your river is going to split up is if it's turning into a delta just as it reaches the ocean. And this is simply because rivers are going to take the path of least resistance, so where it's easiest for the river to flow. And that's not going to be two places. There's going to be one place where it's slightly easier for the river to go, and that's where it's going to go. I also want to say that rivers and streams don't necessarily have to come from the mountains. They can also come from springs, and springs are generally not going to form on a mountain. It's going to form near the foot of a mountain or a hill or in a valley or something like that. But still, of course, a stream that comes from a spring is still going to go downhill, so if it forms in a valley, maybe that valley is actually going to turn into a lake. And so let's talk about lakes. And so again, just a few basic things about lakes. Lakes can have more than one river feeding into it, but it will always have just one river flowing out of it. Again, path of least resistance. There's going to be one place where it's easier for the water to flow out of the lake than anywhere else, and that is where it's going to go. It's also possible that a lake won't have a river draining it. It might just drain from evaporation, but that is very, very unusual, because usually a lake is going to have more water coming into it than can be removed by evaporation, and it's going to need to be drained in some other way. And a lake might not be fed from a river, and it might not be fed from a river that comes from the mountains or from a spring. It could be meltwater around it, or heavy rains and things like that. Or again, like I said, a spring that forms in a valley might form a lake until it can find somewhere for the water to drain. So now you got some mountains and some lakes and some rivers and springs and streams and things like that. Now you need vegetation and animals. And this is sort of where you have to look back at your climate to find out what kind of forest and other plant life would grow in the part of the world that you're working on, and what kind of animals would live there, and something that's going to be important later on, what kind of natural resources do you have? And like I've said before, you do not have to take all of these things into consideration. You don't have to make everything super detailed, but it could be important to just have one or two details that you know and can put into the book, and it's going to make the world look a lot deeper than maybe it is. Now, there are many, many different details that you can go for. One of my favorites is what kind of rock do you have? Because generally when rocks are described in any book, whether it's fantasy or science fiction or contemporary or anything, it's going to be gray. And that's fair enough, that's common, gray rock. But my parents have a summer house on the Åland Islands, and the rock there is often a bit more red than gray. And this is because most rock on the Åland Islands is a certain type of granite, which is red. I also every summer spend at least 1 week on Gotland, which is an island in Sweden where the rocks are generally more white. And this is because the rocks there is limestone, which is not always, bright white, but generally at least lighter gray than other rocks. And one tip there, speaking of limestone, if you want to add caves into your story in any way, then your rock is probably limestone. Because caves that are formed naturally, from water eroding the rock and creating a cave, is formed in limestone and no other stone, apparently. I learned this a little while ago and I thought it was kind of interesting. So that is one of many details that you can look at. What color is the rock? And just put that in and it's going to look a little bit more unique. And again, I want to point out, if you feel like I'm not giving enough concrete examples, like the one I just did, this video is mostly things for you to consider, questions to ask yourself. If you want the more concrete applications, the next video in this series is going to be a workshop where I take these questions and these things that I'm talking about in this video and apply it when I'm creating a world. So stay tuned for that. And also, if you're waiting for me to talk about slightly smaller things like countries and cities and villages and man-made things like that, that is also going to be a different video because it's a slightly different subject. So again, stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe if you're interested in these things. Now, I do also want to give a tip as to what the easiest way to figure these things out is. What kind of climate you should have and what color rock and things like that. I mean, basically, the easiest way to do this is to look at our world. Find a climate that is similar to the one you want to write your story about, find out where that is on the Earth, and put it roughly there on your world as well. And then you can just look, I want roughly this climate, and I want it to look something like this. Okay, that seems to be similar to Germany. And then you look at Germany, and you look at what natural resources they have and what plants and animal life and things like that. And you also look at the kind of rocks they have and natural disasters and things like that, and just use the climate of Germany. You don't necessarily have to make the culture the same as Germany. Just look at what the nature looks like there. And also just a quick thing, if you're creating your own plants and animal life, of course you should make sure that these plants and animals work roughly the same way as the plants and animals do in the real world in that kind of climate. So you don't start creating a plant that would need a lot of water when you're writing about the desert. And I've said this before, but I really want to stress that you do not have to do all of these things. You can be less ambitious and just take a few details. You want a cave, that should be limestone, make the limestone bright white, and you have world built something that is a little bit more unique than many other things. And also, if you're writing fantasy, I like it when things in fantasy can be scientifically explained, but it is perfectly reasonable to just say, the gods decided it was going to be like this. The gods decided there was going to be a desert here, even though there shouldn't be. You can do that, but I would advise you to at least find out if you need to use that excuse, or if you could just make it make sense that there is a desert there. I also want to ask, because I don't know if this is a common thing, does it bother you when fantasy defies science because the gods said so? I didn't used to be bothered by that, and sometimes I'm still not. Depends on how well the author does it, I guess. But what are your opinions on this? Let me know in the comments. And now let's get into astronomy. And this might be very, very ambitious if you're writing fantasy, but this could be the essential thing if you're writing science fiction. Basically, these are some things that you need to think about if you're creating an entire planet, or a solar system, or a universe, or if you just want to create the night sky of your fantasy world. First, let's talk about some basic things about the planet. The easiest way to create a planet is to make it roughly Earth-like. That means the same size and the same rotation and the same tilt and things like that. The reason for this is because if you change something like that, even a small change can be very, very large in the grand scheme of things. So one of the most important things, of course, is that your world should be mostly water. Earth is roughly 70% water. You don't have to measure it, of course, but just make sure that there is more water than land. And if you're putting the planet somewhere in a solar system, make sure that it is in the Goldilocks zone, which is where it's not too cold, not too hot. It is the area around the star where liquid water can actually exist. Liquid water is important. This is if you want life to have evolved on this planet. If you're a fantasy writer and just want the gods to have placed humans on this planet, maybe it's not as important. And if this is a colony where people have arrived from somewhere else, then again, not as important. Unless you want to terraform the world, because otherwise you have to figure out how to get the liquid water to stay liquid. I also want to point out that your world doesn't have to revolve around a sun. It could just as well be a moon, possibly around a gas giant, because there are Goldilocks zones around gas giants as well. And speaking of moons, both fantasy and science fiction worlds, you could make more than one moon. Now, of course, this is going to have an effect on your world. The moon creates tides and a whole bunch of other things. So it might get very complicated. I would maybe do it for fantasy, because then you can make things up a little bit more and not have to do all of the research that goes into figuring out how your tides and what else would be affected by having more than one moon. But if you want to do more research, I like worlds with more than one moon. I think it's neat. Now, some things considering the night sky. If you want your characters to look up at the stars, the night sky changes. The stars don't change, they always stay where they are in relation to each other, but the tilt changes slightly over the seasons, and different parts of the world are going to see different stars, because the planet is going to be aimed in different directions. Also the moon is going to be tilted differently depending on where you are on the planet. So what would be a crescent moon here in Sweden, in Australia would be more like a bowl or a dome. And that's kind of a funny thing, and a thing that I don't feel enough fantasy writers really incorporate into their worlds. And speaking of that, I want to talk about some ways in which you can make your world a little bit more unique. I've talked about the different colored rocks and the moon tilted at a different angle and things like that. Another thing that you can do, especially for your fantasy world, to be a little bit more unique, is to write about the southern hemisphere. Most fantasy books take place in the northern hemisphere, and this is not just for the ones that are inspired by medieval Europe. Most fantasy books overall will take place north of the equator. So if you want to be a little bit more unique, write about the southern hemisphere, where it goes colder the further south you go and things like that, because that part of the world needs more representation, even if it's just in a fantasy world. Another fun thing that I've already mentioned is having your fantasy world be a moon, where in the night sky, or even in the day sky maybe, you can see a large portion of the gas giant that you revolve around. That could be fun. There are also a lot of fun orbits that you can play around with. Maybe your planet or your moon has a tidally locked orbit, where one side faces the sun or the planet the entire time, so one half of the world is always light and one half is always dark. It is possible for life to evolve on a planet like that, but it needs some pretty special circumstances. So this might be better for a colonized planet, or just saying that the gods decided to put humans on a planet like that. Because it is a fact, even though I say I like when fantasy worlds have a lot of basis in science, science is more important when you're writing science fiction, of course, than it is in fantasy. In fantasy, you can get away with fair few things that isn't quite scientifically correct, but it still makes an interesting story. Again though, some might object even more than I do to things like that in fantasy, but a lot of readers aren't really gonna care. Now let's talk about some resources. Where do you go to find the answers to these questions that I have now asked? Start with Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a wonderful place to find information. It has a lot of information about things like that. And I know people say that Wikipedia isn't a great source, but you're writing fiction, you're not writing a scientific essay. Speaking of scientific essays though, if you do want those, if you want more trustworthy sources, then one great place to start is Google Scholar. That is a search engine, well, it's Google for scientific essays and things like that. I've used that a lot when I've been studying. I haven't used it a lot when I've been writing fiction, but if you want to go more in-depth into astronomy or geography or anything else, that is a great place to find really solid sources. Of course, you can always go to your local library and ask them for books on astronomy or things like that. You can even tell them that, hey, I'm writing a fantasy book and I would like some tips on where I can learn things for my world building. They're going to be happy to help you. If your local library can't really help you, maybe try going to a university library. I don't know, I'm going to say I don't know how it works in other parts of the world. I know that in Sweden, anyone can go to a university library and check out books. You don't have to be a student. Maybe you need to be that. If you need to be that, yeah, I'm sorry. Another tip that I know works in Sweden, don't know if it works elsewhere, is looking at the course literature for courses and seeing what books are in the course literature for like basic astronomy courses and read those. That's this book that you can maybe barely see here is The Search of Life in the Universe, which I got for a university course that I was taking on life in the universe and how it evolves and things like that. It was a very interesting course, and especially if you live in Sweden or somewhere else where university education is free, try enrolling in a course. If it's not free, decide if you want to spend money on that or not. Like I said, I'm going to have some links in the description below to resources that I have found very useful for my world building, and if you have any resources that you want to share, please leave a comment and let us know. Also leave a comment if you have any questions or if you have any suggestions for topics for this series, and hit the like button if this video was useful, and again, subscribe if you want to know more about world building, because I have a lot more videos coming. Again, the next video in this series is going to be a workshop on how to implement some of these ideas that I've talked about in this video, so stay tuned for that. I will see you there.